I'm going to go ahead and get us started for our second roundtable. My name is Nico Zeg, one of the co-PIs on this project from West Virginia University. And I was going to offer a reflection based on our first roundtable as part of the SAFER project. So in the first roundtable, which we met, was that a month ago? A month ago, it goes very quickly. Beverly, as the PI on the project, introduced us to the National Science Foundation program, which is funding the SAFER project, and also shared the goals of the planning project by working with engaging with a diverse community of practice of folks that are working around rivers and flooding and conservation. In the first meeting, we had a featured keynote, which was Brenda Bergman, the freshwater director for the Appalachians Global Focal Place for the Nature Conservancy. And Brenda kicked us off by providing three key themes or thoughts around our planning effort around flooding. And the first one was thinking about what collaborative systems approach to flood resilience could look like for this project. And this discussion emphasized integrating applied research with practical flood resilience efforts across the Appalachian region, and also highlighted the importance of understanding the systemic barriers that prevent communities and organizations on advancing flood resilience. Also discussed policy challenges and also emphasized the importance of fostering a multi-state collaborations to address these issues collectively. Brenda also discussed strategic visioning and focused action and provided some important insights, in particular for academics to be thinking about as we engage with a larger community. She stressed the need for a bold vision that surpasses current capabilities to inspire innovative solutions. And she advocated for focusing on key geographic areas within the region, which leverages existing strengths to create a scalable impacts rather than just spreading efforts too thinly across the region. And the third theme that I gleaned from Brenda's talk was adaptive and impact-oriented research. She underscored the values of rapid and iterative research cycles to meet the real-world decision-making timelines, and called for research that not only deepens understanding of flood risk and erosion, but also ways to optimize organizational models and implementation strategies for more effective on-the-ground action. And so Brenda's words really set a good launch for the SAFER project as we think about planning. And following Brenda's presentation, we broke into 3 breakout rooms where we explored three questions around how do the participants and their organizations see flooding in their area? What tools, frameworks, and approaches do the various participants use? And finally, what are your needs to develop and promulgate more effective flood resilience planning? So we explored those 3 questions within the breakout rooms, and I'm going to provide 3 themes that were synthesized across the different breakout rooms. One, there was a collective agreement about flooding and the community impacts throughout the Appalachian region, which in the context of this planning grant, we're really thinking about Vermont down to West Virginia, and having a participant who was also representing the Southern Appalachians, I believe it was Clay Ward from South Carolina, really put in this perspective that the proximity of homes and infrastructure to rivers and the widespread recurring flooding in the Appalachian region poses a really big, seemingly insurmountable challenge. And there was consistency in how the communities seem to be responding to flooding, the similar risks, very steep valleys, V-shaped valleys, shallow soils, and that infrastructure adjacent to riverways. And also collective discourse focused on how these floods are displacing people, importantly are straining local resources, and also emphasize links between flood impacts, environmental justice, and the role that conservation could play in promulgating flood policies. The other theme was conservation and ecosystem resilience. The conversation explored impacts of floods on natural ecosystems, including loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and also highlighted the importance of floodplain restoration, sustainable infrastructure, and the role of biological indicators to assess flood impacts and stream health. And then the third theme was exploration of what nature-based solutions could look like to address these flood challenges. And this was principally discussed by the river and watershed organizations as a means of addressing flood risk, but also exploring the co-benefits of intact or restored landscapes for addressing the flood issues. And then the third question, which really gets to the heart of this planning project, is how can researchers support the needs of other actors across a diverse community of practice that are dealing with flood planning? And there seem to be three needs that came out of the conversation, the last roundtable. And one, there's a need for regionally specific socioeconomic data. And this could be used to understand the trade-offs and cost benefits analysis of culvert and infrastructure and road network replacement. This data could also be used to understand the disruption of floods to the local to regional economy, and also can be used to highlight the benefits of intact ecosystems, the ecosystem services themselves, and co-benefits. A second second need that can be addressed through research is the importance of reconnecting or reactivating floodplains and their ecosystems as a tool to address the flood risks that are increasing throughout the region. And then the third need was the need to quantify erosional hazards in a similar way that flood inundation models are being used to drive planning and risk. And adaptation. Erosion largely is left out of the conversation around flood planning, and so there is an apparent need to provide tools that can capture the erosional hazards, especially as we move farther north in the Appalachians, where it's a post-glacial landscape with lots of sediments that occupy the valley. And so with that, I will pause and move it on to the next speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Nicholas. I'm the Penn State lead for the Safer Apps project. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lara Fowler, my friend and colleague. Lara's an attorney, educator, and mediator who is an expert in many, many things, but in particularly works in the areas of water law and policy. She's worked extensively on the West Coast on issues related to water and flooding in Washington and Oregon. Turns out Lara and I were in graduate school at the University of Washington at the same time, but didn't know each other then, but met up when she came to Penn State. We arrived within a year of each other. Lara and I have collaborated on a variety of projects, including one that's maybe most relevant for this effort, which is a Penn State funded initiative to help boost and understand the flood resilience of small riverine communities in Pennsylvania. Currently, Lara is Pennsylvania's Chief Sustainability Officer. And I think I'll keep my remarks to that for now and let Lara take over. Thanks for joining us today, Lara.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks to be here. Flooding is a question near and dear to my heart for a variety of reasons. And actually, starting from the personal side, a good friend of mine is in Vermont. Her and her family lost everything last summer, everything. And so it's one thing to work on the question of flooding. It's one thing to be a facilitator, say, of an authority working to recover from flooding. It's another thing to work with a friend through the utmost tragedy of this. So thrilled about this project, thrilled about what you're working on. I would love actually some help if you all could introduce yourselves in the chat and just name, affiliation, kind of what you're working on vis-a-vis flooding. Because what I'm hoping to do is sketch out some really quick thoughts of having, as Rob said, worked as an attorney, a mediator, a facilitator, a researcher, wearing a lot of different hats. And I'm going to give you a case study of what I worked on in Washington State before moving here, and then sketch through a few other just ideas, but then really hope to use the bulk of our time actually for a discussion. So again, if you could introduce yourself, and Beverly or Rob, if you can, and put the prompt in chat. Let me share, if I may, my slides just to walk you through, in part because the visuals on some of these things really make a difference. Oops, just a moment. Zoom is doing what Zoom sometimes does. There, can you see the full screen?
Yep.
Yeah. So just a cover slide, just real, Rob mentioned my background. I got my start as a student researcher, and it's a shout out actually. I was talking with a colleague in Wisconsin who was doing ethnographic studies of flooding and using students for that to go out and interview people. I think can be really, really powerful. Just kind of tuck that aside. But I got my start as a student researcher, did public policy for the Oregon Water Resources Department, and then worked, these are the river basins I worked in on the West Coast. Moved here 12 years ago to have a joint position between our Institute of Energy and Law, Environment and teaching law, serving as Penn State's Chief Sustainability Officer. But also had a chance to really work on questions of Chesapeake Bay related questions. We are dead smack in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay region right there. Rob mentioned the flooding side of things, but my focus for a long time has been on flooding. I've served as a facilitator for the Chehalis Basin Flood Authority in Washington State. When I moved to Pennsylvania in 2012, started to hear a lot about Tropical Storm Lee in 2011. And I was like, I worked on flooding issues and I had no idea. All I was hearing about was the news of Irene in August and September of 2011, but I hadn't realized how super saturated the world had become because of Tropical Storm Lee. Led me into a question and leading a research project looking at the flood insurance impacts in Pennsylvania. I don't think I'll ever forget the interview that we did where somebody was like, I can live with flooding. I cannot live with flood insurance. And we can unpack that a little bit. But then Rob mentioned the Penn State Initiative for Resilient Communities, and I'll come back and touch that real briefly here. These are really challenging issues, right? You know, people will talk about wicked issues, but context and place really matters. A lot of environmental issues are super, super challenging, and they're just getting harder. We're seeing examples of this stuff play out all over the world, but it hits home. Again, talking with my friends Jenny and John in the aftermath of them losing their house to a flood last year, was to realize just how personally and long lasting the devastation of this is. But you've got public engagement, you have population changes, you have who is impacted and how, you have different decision making authorities, and then again, the dynamics from individual all the way up to international and back. We are seeing storms get more severe, heavier, more frequent, and that's causing more flooding questions. So I also really think about the issue and the challenge that we're dealing with, that water is transboundary. And I don't know if folks have seen this map. I love this map of the United States because it makes you look at it in a really, really different way, right? If you drop the state boundaries out and just look at water as if it were the veins in your heart, you see something quite different. And in where we are in the Appalachian region, from Vermont all the way down to West Virginia, we are in a hodgepodge of watersheds, watershed basins, and transboundary questions. Um, so I want to give you the example of the Chehalis Basin. Pause for a moment and take a look at this. What do you see? Just take yourself off mute. What do you see in this picture? Anybody?
Flooded roads and houses.
Flooded roads and houses. What else do you see?
Very little vegetation.
Yeah, not so much vegetation. Yep.
Distant mountains.
What's that?
Distant mountains.
Yeah. Distant mountains. Yeah, and if you happen to live on that mountain, you were probably doing okay. If you were not living on that mountain, you were not okay. Yeah, this is the Chehalis Basin. This is midway between Portland and Seattle in 2007. They got about 18 inches of rain in 24 hours. There's not a river basin anywhere in the world that it can manage that amount of water. There just isn't. This is flatter than a lot of the Appalachian region that we're working in, right? More room for the river to spread out. But this is Interstate 5. This is a freeway. that was underwater for quite a bit of time. And you can imagine the screaming that took place about inability to get that open. So I want to walk through and want you to, I'm kind of presenting this as a challenge, but also the opportunity. And what centers me, I think, in the work today in this region is to say, I know how hard it is to take something like this incredibly challenging situation and find solutions. So Carpenter and Kennedy have a fantastic book called Managing Public Disputes. It's out of print, but you can still find copies of it. I actually use it as a textbook with my law students to cover, because I think it's just the most practical handbook I have seen on how do you handle something that's really challenging. They talk about a spiral of unmanaged conflict. A problem emerges, sides form, positions harden, communication stops, resources are committed, conflict goes outside the community, perceptions are distorted, and a sense of crisis emerges. This happens in lightning speed with the internet and social media, even faster. This is the picture a couple weeks after the flood in 2007, early January 2008. You could look at this and say, Washington State, you are lousy with your forestry practices. That's clearly what caused this flood. This is the front page of the New York Times. This is not what you want to have happen to your basin because it makes that conflict much harder. The rest of the world's looking at you and saying, you suck. Now what, right? And so what's interesting in that particular basin, people were coming in with a position of we need to stop the flooding. But somebody in a discussion, and I want to give this to you as one thought experiment. If you look at the picture down below, you can see the edge of the airport is not where you want your airplanes, tucked up as high as possible. The river is supposed to be over here. It's gone really quite wider. But in a workshop, somebody said, we are asking the wrong questions. There is no river basin. There's no umbrella big enough to put over a river basin this size. We're asking not how do you stop the flooding, but how do we address the impacts? Who is impacted? How do we meet other needs? And counterintuitively in this basin, we made the problem bigger. We raised the questions not only of flooding, of communities and transportation, but of tribal and indigenous questions, of habitat and fisheries, of drought during the summertime, of a flashier system. So the strategy that's currently being implemented today is reducing flood damage and restoring aquatic species. The word "and" is a really powerful tool in your toolkit. Use it, right? So creation of a local flood authority. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I'd rather get to the discussion, but the governor said, look, I can create solutions and tell you what to do. You're not going to like it, but I'm going to create an authority whose job is to meet and develop solutions from the bottom up. She put money not only for projects, but for process and facilitation. We adapted that process and rotated it. Y'all have been in meeting rooms that look a lot like the one in the picture above, right? But we started to rotate where we were, take people on tours, do workshops, and that the governor and the governor's office reinforced the local bottom-up nature of this with a whole bunch of decision makers, the press, tribes, public outreach. I spent a lot of time with newspaper reporters trying to bring them up to speed because I needed them to cover what was happening. Just as a side, I don't have a slide on this, but when things were going poorly, the press covered everything. As soon as things started to go well, we had to write our own stories. Bad news sells, good news doesn't, but people wanted to know, right? It was a lot of time talking. We were very transparent with all the meetings. You can go look at every single meeting, every single agenda, all the outcomes of it. Anybody could access an example of tours, but we used ground rules. We used a definition of consensus, building relationships, again, understanding those deep lying fears, building, addressing issues and then building success on smaller things, dealing with the uncertainty, but really focused on and did some trainings on active listening. What did that actually mean? We led to a lot of work, right? They eventually went, and I pulled just in the interest of time, some headlines that basically was a fight to, okay, we leveraged $28.6 million. Resources is always a question. It was in this basin, but went from the worst place in the country to work on flooding to winning national awards in 2019, right? People realized, hey, we're all in this together. And it went from, again, we're working with a number of big to small projects all across the basin. Former board member Ron Averill basically said, look, these smaller projects, the grassroots, people see the value and we're able to actually gain traction in these areas. Fast forward to January 22. What I would say, there's a massive flood in December of 2007, 18 months later, in 2009, another one. One of the challenges of flooding, as you all probably know, is a sunny day mentality. It's sunny, people forget about it. We certainly were running into this when we were working along the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. It hadn't massively flooded since 2011. It's not on top of our mind. The Chehalis Basin, 2 floods 18 months apart, and I can only imagine what's going through the minds of folks in Kentucky right now. They have barely, if not at all, cleaned up from the last flood, get hit again. So one thing that made it easier in the Chehalis was it was on everybody's mind. Fast forward to January 2022, and another similarly big flood hit. Each of the 2 floods, 2007 and 2009, each caused about $300 to $400 million worth of damage. Ton of work to identify potential solutions. You know, a workshop where a farmer says, look, if my cows could have just simply walked themselves up a hill, they wouldn't have drowned. And everyone's like, what are you proposing? He's like, I don't know, something like a critter pad. Everyone's like, oh, what's a critter pad? I don't know, a big pile of dirt that a cow could walk up and self-rescue. Ton of study. If you put in something like that, would it make it worse? Could you deal with something like that? Lots of investment of small projects to big projects. And in this flood in 2022 is $13.8 million worth of damage. You had an early warning system that people had said was really important to them that allowed them to get timely information. You had those critter pads that allowed people to drive a tractor up or let their cows self-rescue, and much less damage. You had identified issues with different towns, the airport or sewage treatment plants that were fixed and protected because of this. And so again, you really saw actually a shift from not only working on flooding issues, but to a lot of other questions, right? We were dealing with the substantive issues, but we built the relationships and improved the dynamic and the process to get there, allowed people to have a hard conversation about it. I love this quote. This was from a radio talk show, it's a while ago now, but a realization in these 3 very different counties that people were able to hear that there was an order to projects. You couldn't do everything all at once, but everybody was in it together, right? So I'm often, as a facilitator or mediator, listening to how people phrase things. Is it I and me and my community, or is it us and our community? And they shifted actually in this process. So want to tell you that it can work. I do think facilitation can be really helpful, a neutral third party. This is a picture actually of my students leading a watershed forum here in central Pennsylvania in 2018. How do you identify who is interested in coming to the table? What are the issues they're interested in? How do you improve communication if people don't trust each other very much? How do you translate or reframe questions to be something you can work with, and maybe translate it into a research question that researchers can work with? I'll come back to that in a moment. Exploring interests. There's a difference between position and interest, and again, I'll unpack that more. Generating options, right? Really generating or brainstorming what might be that connects some of the dots. And again, in the Chehalis, the issues were not just flooding and community impacts, but habitat degradation during the summertime. When we made and combined those things, it opened up the scope for actually finding solutions. Reality testing, building trust, handling bad behavior. Somebody is always blowing up in a meeting. How do you handle that? A third-party facilitator might help. Think through agreements and then ensure implementation. People in process matter. Again, I already identified this, but if you've got folks who just don't trust each other, you're going to have a hard time talking about the substance. So sometimes thinking through the process of how you get there can help make a difference. Again, water, environmental issues really matter on these topics. I mentioned positions versus interests, right? A position might be something like, this is a picture from the Chehalis, a dam will stop the flooding. I actually had Ron Averill, who you saw earlier, say, give me dynamite, I'll blow up the Mellon Street Bridge, that will stop the flooding. Somebody else is like, I don't want a dam built, that's a terrible idea. So the position is something they've decided on. This is the answer. That's different from the interests, the values or concerns that motivate you and often actually provide more common ground. The health and safety. I don't want to be rescuing a kid out of a flood zone. like in this picture. That's not okay for anybody. What's people's personal well-being? Our livelihoods, our economic developments, our housing, our businesses are wrecked. Access to electricity, power, food, water, transportation, and many more allowed for space at that conversation. But our challenge is people would come to a meeting because they wanted to prevent something bad happening, or they didn't know what they wanted. That is different from what do I want? I don't want you to build a dam. I don't want you to do this. Well, what do you want? I don't know. So we spent a lot of time unpacking the interest to build something proactively together. I often think too about transboundary water management. I'm shifting out of the Chehalis Basin to say there's lots of good examples. This is the Walla Walla River Basin, which starts in Washington, starts in Oregon and flows into Washington State. They actually suspended the rules of water allocation in that area to say, how do we get more water in stream for fish? And we are going to throw out or suspend for 20 years the state rules appropriate to this. Sometimes you can sandbox or create a regulatory space to try something new. And it can be a way to open up the conversation a little bit. So I think transboundary is both challenging, but also an opportunity to think through. Local watersheds groups really can and do really make a big difference. I know that different states have different approaches to it. This is a picture from Oregon. The Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board has been in place since the late 90s, really pulling together local watershed groups to actually address those bottom-up questions. And it's something I'd love. Is there flood resilience districts or efforts that can help us think through this? Are there existing groups or leaders that you can start to bring together from different perspectives to find solutions? And then research projects, again, Rob mentioned one of them, another one. So the one he mentioned is the Penn State Initiative for Resilient Communities, where we were really thinking about how do we work with the community, particularly of Selinsgrove along the Susquehanna River, that was chronically flooded. The Isle of Kew is partly pictured here, would end up underwater, but they didn't have the most recent research, which we were able to bring to them, but start to actually have conversations. Or the other project that I've got up here, the Water for Ag, we were actually working in Pennsylvania, Nebraska, and Arizona on the radical notion that if you were going to deal with water for and from agriculture, you'd go talk to the local folks first about what their issues were. And in all 5 areas where we created local leadership teams, they all struggled a little bit with, well, what are you asking us to do? You're not telling us anything, but you are asking, you are listening. Allowed us to kind of work through a U shape where at some point they were like, we don't know why we're doing this. And in all 5 areas, eventually they were like, we know exactly why we're doing this. We have that local capacity for bridging hard conversations, framing research questions together, bringing in information, and starting to implement solutions.
Thank you, Laura, for your time in joining us today and illustrating some of the challenges that you've been engaged with and really vexing flooding situations in different geographies. I'll say that our next roundtable session in a month is going to segue a bit into the ways in which universities have been able to engage with practitioners in a state to address flood challenges. Our presenter will be Dr. Jamie Shin, who was at West Virginia University and has since moved to New York. But her presentation to the group will be on how West Virginia has developed a flood resiliency framework as a partnership between the university and stakeholders in that state, and another opportunity to sort of look at an example of successful university practitioner partnerships. Okay, an hour always goes by very quickly. Hannah Fisher is going to drop a poll into the chat, and we'll follow up with an email request if you don't have time to stay on and complete our poll now. We're just looking for a little feedback from participants today as we wrap up the session. And again, I think Laura, invite Nico and Rob to turn on their mics if they would like, and we'll close it out in just a minute.
Yeah, thank you so much for your taking your time to participate. And I will say, I think the near silence of demonstrable success projects between researchers and community groups really highlights a critical gap, which I think we all know, but it does speak to how important it is to gather success stories, which was mentioned earlier. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, and I do urge all of you to, if think of things after this, opportunities for the research community to help communities build flood resilience, to partner with communities, please do reach out and share your ideas, because we would love to hear those and include them as a follow-up to the discussion here today.